This morning we're moving on to the next section of the notes, which concerns the quality of Bernard's writing, and in particular Bernard as an exponent of what Jean Leclerc has correctly called, I think, or well called, monastic theology. One of the things that characterized a lot of work on Bernard in the 30s and 40s was a fair measure of defensiveness. People were saying, well, everybody knows that you have the Trinity, and then you have Thomas Aquinas, and then you have other people. And somehow Thomas Aquinas seemed to be almost God, certainly the eternal embodiment of changeless truth. And so when you look at somebody like Bernard in comparison with Thomas Aquinas, people were scratching themselves and saying, does he deserve to be called a theologian at all? Is this guy, what is he? He talks about lilies and that sort of thing, but is he a theologian? He doesn't have any distinctions or definitions and things. Can he be called a theologian? Is he not only a pious writer? And so, in, I think it was 1935, the book of Gilson, The Mystical Theology of St. Bernard, came out with one of its ambitions to try and establish the fact that Bernard was a serious theologian, as serious a theologian in his own peculiar way as Aquinas was. But generally, reading that book today, which isn't always easy reading, one is struck by how defensive it is. Many of the papers which appeared around 1953, which was the centenary of the death of St. Bernard, I suppose, let's do some sums, it would be the 8th centenary of the death, carried on this theme. They were 20 years or so after Gilson's book and carried on that theme to try and show just how Bernard was really a good theologian. So you get St. Bernard and Our Lady, St. Bernard and the Church, St. Bernard and angels. And everybody kind of said, what is Bernard's theology? And at the end of that, or a few years after that, people began to suddenly say, well, Bernard did have a theology. It certainly was not scholastic theology, but it was certainly theology. And I suppose to some extent in the 60s, especially in proportion with the waning of scholastic philosophy and theology, that Bernard began to be recognized as a theologian in his own right. There are a couple of terms that were given to the sort of theology which is embodied in Bernard and in so many writers of the 11th and 12th centuries. It could be called early scholastic or pre-scholastic theology. And they were the two terms that were used first, pre-scholastic and early scholastic. But both of these seem to be negative, as though saying that you hadn't reached a level of culture that was later to come, and didn't give enough strength to the idea that this was a qualitatively different form of theology. And that's why I think Jean Leclerc's tentative essays in this direction, first of all simply dropping the term, and the next one giving a couple of paragraphs of explanation, and progressively using it in his own articles, which meant it appeared everywhere, until it's more or less accepted that there was a style of theology in the 12th century which was a perfectly acceptable style of theology, but which wasn't in the same mold as scholastic philosophy and psychology. I wrote an article on this once, but I don't have it with me anyhow, but I'm only going to quote you the title, because the title is actually a quotation from that book by Pilger, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And the title is this: emotionally hollow, aesthetically meaningless and spiritually empty. Needless to say, I was referring it to a certain style of theologizing, that especially a debased style, which doesn't touch the emotions, emotionally hollow, which isn't very nice to read, which doesn't necessarily mean it's written in Rainerian German, but it has no aesthetic quality, and it has no appeal to the spirit, and spiritually empty. And it was an article which led towards the idea of monastic theology. But I think it's interesting to know that this type of abstract, objective, analytic theology that we find in Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism and its imitators is completely different to what monastic theology was. If you've got an alphabetical mind, well, you can say some of the qualities of monastic theology are that it's aesthetic, it's behavioural, it's corporate. I had one for D, I forget what it was. It's devotional, and so forth. But let's just look at it a little bit more concretely. And the first thing to say about monastic theology is that it is poetic rather than rational. It's poetic rather than rational. What does this mean exactly? The monks in the Middle Ages were very literate people, and they studied mainly not for a knowledge of canon law or a knowledge of dialectics, but they studied because they enjoyed good writing and cherished it as a medium that was appropriate for a spiritual message. They read a lot of McLuhan in the Middle Ages, and if it's true that the medium is the message, then if you're speaking about God, to speak about God in ugly words it means that the medium is out of proportion to the subject that you're speaking about. And so, to some extent, the only way of speaking about God is to speak about God in poetry, in beautiful language, in terms that can move and can touch. And if you flip through your Bibles, if you happen to have ever seen one, you'll notice that a lot of them is written in that very most obscure of biblical languages, which isn't Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic, but poetry. You only have to look at, there's more space at the side of it. When Jesus spoke about the kingdom of his Father and about his Father himself, he didn't use polysyllabic Teutonic expressions, but rather he took a picture of a hen and a chicken and said, well, that says a lot about God. And he spoke in poetry. He could have defined God in terms of aseitas and left people to wonder what on earth. He could have anticipated Thomas Aquinas, one presumes, but instead he went to talk about what we call in Australia the chooks, chickens, hens, fowl, poultry. He talked about the chooks. And he said, look at the chooks and you'll understand something about God. He used this mysterious language of poetry. And one of the characteristics of monastic theology is not that it's written in poetry. I know a certain gentleman who tried to present a thesis at Louvain written in blank verse. And the response of the faculty was somewhat more than blank. But generally, not that they wrote it in poetry, but rather that they used poetic types of mechanisms and so forth. Secondly, it was more scriptural or liturgical than philosophical. In one sense, that we know that Aquinas read the scriptures, we know that he commented on scriptures, his commentaries on St. Paul, the Catena Aurea. We know that he'd studied the scriptures and the commentaries of the fathers very extensively. But when he sat down to write theology, he put away these childish things. and concentrated on the heavy stuff, which was philosophical reasoning and dialectic and so forth. Now, we get very little of philosophers in monastic theology, but you do get a lot of emphasis on Scripture, not so much in the form of commentaries or in the form of anything that makes a great deal of sense to a modern exegete, but just that they knew the Scriptures and they loved the Scriptures. And liturgical texts and the liturgical Scriptures and so forth are integral to this part of the process. It's quite interesting that when they started to write a book, one of the aspect of monastic commentaries is that they're nearly always unfinished. They're interrupted by the death of the author, simply because they weren't interested in just getting a book out, the way Augustine was, even with his Enarrationes in Psalmos. He went back over the Psalms he'd never preached on and kind of roughed out something to fill in the gaps so that he had a full book of comments on all the Psalms. So they're not a philosophical model that they're talking about, but rather they're interested in starting from the Scriptures and not departing from the Scriptures. They stay with the Scriptures and the scriptural messages. And as a result, they're synthetic rather than analytic. There are moments of analysis, and this is, you'll notice, that is more than sign. But the emphasis was usually on putting something together, on putting text together, on moving deeper into the whole mystery of salvation, and not ever concentrating on one part. And that's why Bernard can stand up at the most extraordinary times and preach a sermon which would be admirable for the opposite end of the calendar. It's almost as though he's come in on, 3 months late or something. But at Christmas, his mind automatically goes out, not to Christmas, which he knows is in everybody's mind, but to another aspect of the Christian mystery. And he kind of complements what's in their mind and been coming to them from the Scriptures in a very complementary sort of way by referring it to the whole context of the mystery of salvation and applying it to themselves. And that's one of his geniuses, that he doesn't get lost in one aspect, but constantly looking at the whole. It's behavioural rather than abstract, quite professedly behavioural. The word they used for behavioural was moral. And so the moral sense of Scripture was the Scripture applied to experience and applied to behaviour. And opening phrases of the Sermons on the Song of Songs, and Bernard deliberately changes the traditional orders. You can't understand it unless you look back at Origen's commentary and Cassian, for example, Gregory the Great. He has the three books that should be studied by. You have Proverbs for good behaviour. You have the Song of Songs for the lofty things, and you have Ecclesiastes for despising the world, vanity of vanities, and so forth. And everybody used to give these a kind of priority and order them, and they're always the same, both east and west, starting from Origen. Bernard changes that order to give ultimate meaning to the moral books, the books that deal with behaviour, the books that are practical, the books that can help us live a better life. And so the whole purpose of his preaching at all times was that when you go out that door, or this door, or through the window, that you go out better people. Not that you go out more knowledgeable people, not that you go out with a greater sharpness of intellect, but rather that you go out and live a better life. And so what he's doing is helping us to understand our experience and helping us to translate that into practice. And then these are many ways of saying the same thing. It's devotional rather than informational. It's professedly designed to help us to say our prayers. It's as simple as that. He describes things. There are all sorts of things you can say about the Ascension, for example. You could start describing the geography of Palestine and the history of the Mount of Olives. You could go into the production of olives if you wanted to. But there are all sorts of things. You could approach it from that angle. You could approach it from a philosophical. There used to be a dean, Anglican dean in Sydney, who used to preach every year the same sermon, which was, why up? You know, why did Christ descend up, particularly in Australia? He would have gone through the earth. But there are all sorts of ways of approaching it, but Bernard would habitually approach it in such a way that it made it easier for us to pray. Not only easier to live well, but just easier to pray. That prayer would come more naturally and spontaneously from taking on this type of information, if you like, or this type of approach. It's feelingful rather than intellectual. And so, because, and this connects with the other things, because he needs us to act, he has to stimulate our feelings. Because he uses poetic devices and all the arms of rhetoric, then he's able to touch our feelings, able to get us moving. You know, if you want to get a crowd to go and burn down the local opposition, well, you have to get them stirred up, and you get them there by the use of oratory and so forth, and then from this being stirred up, they have the energy to do something, go and burn down the opposition or string them up on a tree or something like that. Well, it's the same with everything, that if you want somebody to live a good life, you've got to get them the energy. I mean, you know, if we had some pills we could pass out for good living, we'd all like to swallow them. But in fact, we won't live well unless we have the energy to live well. And most of us have limited energy, and that's why we don't live better. But we get our energy from the way that we feel. And if you can change the feeling about yourself, feeling about your job, feeling about the people that you work with, feeling about how you fit into the whole scheme of things, feeling about what you're feeling even, then you're more likely to do the right thing, you're more likely to have energy for prayer and so forth. So it was a sort of writing that was designed to touch our feelings. It isn't completely empty of any intellectual content, I'm not saying that, but it is designed at this level of feeling as well. And the other thing that we have to say is that it's corporate rather than individual. Monastic theology is not a highly individual sort of writing that you can immediately say this doctrine is specific to this particular person. It's not that at all, but it's rather the doctrine as a whole is generally simply the common doctrine of the Church, without a great deal of particularity, but just applied and made living and made exciting and made stimulating so that you can go forth not only as individuals, but also as a community, also as a body of people, animated by the same beliefs and values. And if you have the same beliefs and values, then it becomes much easier to live together and to work together and so forth. Okay, if we just, for the moment, take that that's a rough enough approximation of the writing of monastic theology, can anybody tell me, therefore, how do we read it? If that's the way it's written, and we've got to read it as it was written, and not pretend it's the telephone book or instructions for the lawnmower or anything like that, you read those in different ways because they belong to different genres. But this is a special type, a specific genre of writing. Then what are the qualities that should characterize our reading of it? Any suggestions? Yes. You must have been reading something. Therefore, I'll pull it over here, we must read it receptively. The way to read it is not analysing every word, not saying what does this mean, but not actively so much, but as receptively, prayerfully, and, if you like this kind of Reader's Digest jargon, using the right brain, which is the part of us that deals with the perception of wholes, the part of us that deals with appreciation of music, appreciation of art, creativity, literature, that sort of thing, not our mathematical, scientific kind of logical functions, but leaving logic on the hook behind the door for a moment, just giving ourselves to the flow of it, allowing ourselves to be bewitched, if you can say that, to be fascinated, to be entranced, so that it leads us along, because, in other words, almost hypnotized, allowing ourselves simply to be quiet before it and to let it do with us what it would. Be thou the house, and it the husband dwelling therein, says the author of The Cloud of Unknowing. Be thou the block of wood, and it the craftsman. In other words, to allow this kind of thing to act upon us. You know, if you're reading poetry, or you're listening, better still, to a reading of poetry by the person who wrote it, it's a very powerful, if it is a good poet, it's a very powerful experience, because there's a communication of a lot of energy there. But you can't go there and say, I'm going to count whether there really are 14 lines in his sonnet and whether the verse rhythm is right. You've just got to close the blinds on logic and allow yourself to go with the movement of it, and allow yourself to be moved and to be carried by the sway of it. And really, this is what we're talking about when we say using the right brain, that we read this thing ideally as Lectio Divina. It's not meant to be read as anything else. All right, you can sit down and write a doctoral thesis on it if you want to, if you're that sort of weirdo. But and it is possible, and so forth. But the real way of reading it is just to give yourself to the text and allow it to push you around and so forth. And that's, I think, very important for us to see that. You know, not to get too much on the crusading kind of tone, but it's, you know, our reading in the normal sense in monastic life should move towards these types of monastic writings, simply because they give us the beliefs and values that enable us to live the demands of a practical monastic life. Otherwise, if we're not getting those beliefs and values, we'll find it constantly a struggle. We'll find within ourselves opposition and resistance to everything that happens in the monastery. Whereas this way that we allow ourselves progressively and very slowly to be influenced in our personal philosophy of life over a period of time. And that's what these texts were written for. They weren't written for information, but to really understand them, we have to give ourselves to them, as monks and nuns, or monkesses. As monastic persons, we give ourselves to them, allow ourselves to be swept by them, to be conditioned by them. Now, I think it's also important, you know, in the context that living as we often do in fairly isolated communities, relatively isolated communities, that it's important that we constantly have access not only to the kind of formation that's going on in the particular monastery that we're in, but also formation in the wider monastic tradition to which we are called. Okay, we might just read through some of this. It repeats a bit, but good things are worth repeating, says he. Bernard's writings as a whole need to be understood within the general context of that special mode of reflection which Jean Leclerc has termed monastic theology. Their priorities are practical rather than intellectual, intuitive, synthetic and devotional rather than rational, analytic and objective, or as we might say, right brain activities rather than left brain. And you'll probably find if we took some votes here, or divided the room between those who find difficulty with monastic writings and those who don't, you'd probably find that it's at that level of approach that we've got so used to. Those who find difficulty with monastic writings are often those who are so used to operating from a highly logical, scientific viewpoint. I don't know if you've ever seen the Postulant's Guide that Matt Kelty wrote for Gethsemane. But in that, one of the kind of things that he says it's just touch and go. There's people who studied science. He kind of says, well, it may be all right if it isn't too much. I presume, I meant to ask him about it, but I presume it's from experience that people with a mind highly trained in scientific methodology, in physics or something like that, measuring everything and predicting things and so forth, may very well find it hard to fit into the monastic way of life and the monastic, you might say, ideology or way of looking at things. Anyway, that's just an aside. I can be contradicted if you wish. It's important to appreciate Bernard within this context. Otherwise, he may appear no more than a precursor of pietism or an inadequate antecedent of scholasticism. In fact, he was neither. He was a substantial theologian in his own right who deservedly received the title of Doctor of the Church. Three concerns regularly appear in much of Bernard's work. Firstly, what he wrote was intended as a guide for behaviour and a stimulus to prayer. Often this was coupled with a zeal for reform and a desire to propagate the ideals and values of Cîteaux. Secondly, he drew his inspiration not from his own subjectivity, about which he's quite reticent. There are a lot of texts in which he talks about his own experience, but they're among the most literary texts that we have. And it's probably the literary eye that he's referring to, rather than himself. We'll probably see some of those. But his inspiration mainly came from tradition, from the Bible, the Fathers, and the accepted practice within the Church. And thirdly, he was almost obsessed with style. He wrote well and he communicated to his readers. It wasn't a kind of narcissistic celebration of his own literary prowess, but rather he communicated. He wrote, he used his gifts to touch people, to move people, to sing their song. As a result, he was often, rather unrealistically, impatient with compromise, mediocrity, and a preference for the base. I can see some of you have those things. But do you know people like that? Again, ask yourself, this time, people that are just so hooked on quality themselves that they can't understand why you sit down and read pulp novels. They can't understand why you watch all that rubbish on television. They can't understand why anybody would drink anything that was made after 1975, or, it's a kind of thing, obsession with style, and Bernard had that bit, but he used it to good effect. A number of points may be made briefly about some characteristic features of Bernard's spiritual teaching. Their meaning will become clearer with the examinations of the writings themselves. First of all, Bernard's doctrine was not a universalizing of his own experience in the way that Luther's is, for example. They say that the reason that Luther was so successful in getting a following is that in universalizing his own experience, he found that a lot of other people had the same experience and that they identified with him. Now, his starting point was just simply his own doubts and his own scruples, perhaps even. His own feeling of repression under the system that was operating in the church at that time. And other people identified with that and so enjoyed his writings and continue to do so. But if you don't happen to identify with that particular experience, and you say, what in the hell is Luther talking about? What's with this guy, he's starting from a point which is not mine, and so it's very hard for me to get much of value. Now, Bernard didn't. Although he's a very experiential, he didn't simply start with his own subjective experience. Bernard was more interested in expressing the faith of the church than in expressing himself. Now, it's something which he himself experienced, but it's not his private experience, if you can get this distinction. It's something that everybody, it's universal before it came to him. He's expressing what many people experience. And I think that one of the differences, or one of the reasons for this, is simply that Bernard, as a pastor, knew that not only were his experiences his own, but knew that other people had the same experiences. And so when he spoke, he was speaking out of a more corporate basis. When he does refer to his own experience, it's usually in conventional literary terms which, despite appearances, never involve full exposure. The mystery of Bernard's being remains Bernard's own and God's. So we don't really know a great deal about his inner life. We have to work pretty hard to find it out, despite some passages in which he just opens his Macintosh, as it were, and shows himself. But it's a purely literary thing, and the result is what he wants the reader to have. It's a way, often he's talking about somebody else rather than himself. So he seems to be very frank and very open and so forth, occasionally about himself. But in fact, it's rather more difficult. Okay, second point is, these have got nothing to do with the price of fish. They've got nothing to do with, they're just random points to conclude an introduction. There is, accordingly, a solid objective content in Bernard's writing which is paramount to his purpose. He's a good writer and it can be great fun reading him, but there is always good content there. He does not wish to be regarded as original thinker, but as one who so loves the mysteries of faith that he can express them with fervour and apply them faithfully to the circumstances of daily life. So it's not all froth and bubble. It is rather, there is good, solid content under the star. Thirdly, in one sense, there are very few Bernardine themes, if by this term one is understood obsessions throbbing for release. You get some people who always get round to preaching on the same thing. No matter what they're talking about, they come back to a couple of themes, and it's a delight for people in subsequent centuries doing theses on them. So you can extract a characteristic thought and say, well, this comes up in this theme and in this chapter and so forth. Bernard is not like that, strangely enough, and it's quite difficult to get themes out of him, really. His subject matter is habitually determined by such factors as the cycle of liturgical feasts. So he will simply speak on the feasts, whatever they are, and his own often rather exotic interpretations, the scriptural texts which he uses as a basis for comment, the situation addressed, and that includes, when somebody like William of St. Thierry has got him stirred up about something. Do you have do you have solicitors and barristers in Canada? Solicitors and barristers, the distinction. You do? Mm-hmm. You know that a barrister is the man who appears in court. Huh? It's the solicitor who often relates with the client and gets all the data. And usually a solicitor has to brief the barrister. So he gives him all the information and the barrister goes in and says, he puts up the show. Well, Bernard was more like a barrister than a solicitor. William of St. Thierry was his solicitor. He would come and say, Abelard is saying this. And then Bernard would go in and thunder, how dare you say this statement, and so forth. He'd say the black monks are doing this, and Bernard would condemn the black monks, and somebody is saying this about so-and-so. And so, in one sense, there was that relationship that Bernard, if somebody told him that there was an abuse to be corrected, he would go off at a tangent. And so it wasn't that he had an obsession with particular things, although he did have his own opinions on a number of crucial issues, but he often just responded to the data that was given to him by somebody like William. And finally, the commonplaces of monastic culture, and particularly in the Sententiae, Bernard is always talking about the experiences that ordinary monks, and I suppose nuns also have, in living a monastic life. And he would return to these very, very naturally. Okay, so he didn't have a couple of things which he hammered all the time, but rather he was very, you'd never know. If he came in here this morning to give a talk, you would never know what he was going to talk about. There are some people you do know what they're going to talk about. My abbot would be one. He's been hammering the same point for 30 years. and it's his one basic insight, which is carried through to the whole thing of monastic life. But when he talks, he usually keeps coming back and back to the same point. He tries to start a series on something else and ends back with this thing, which is admittedly a very central theme in monastic life, but at the same time you can see the pendulum swinging back. Bernard was not like that. He comes in here and you wouldn't know what he's going to talk on. He may talk on anything at all. D. Bernard recognized levels of sophistication, so he was able to talk at different levels as well, and was adept at nuancing his thought to suit the audiences he addressed, using different genres of writing and so forth. Nor did he demand the same degree of purity and fidelity of all that he did of monks. So he's got this text that of St. Paul in Romans, that I'm the servant both of the wise and the foolish. Well, he said bishops, for example, they're the servants of the wise and the foolish, and they can't do everything that's theoretically desirable because people are so foolish they can't take that high level of sophisticated Christianity. They've got to be satisfied with a lower level. But monks, he expected a lot more of monks. They should know better. And we'll see some examples of this in the next section. Okay, number E, this is an important one, although I don't want to be misunderstood. Not all the assertions made about Bernard's Christology and Mariology are accurate. And that means most of them are not. A lot of the easy assertions are just inaccurate. Although he could speak with great charm of the human condition of the infant Jesus, it was the ascension which was the focus of his special devotion. It was direct spiritual contact with the Word that Bernard propagated, not imaginative reproductions of the events of his earthly life. Now, it's true that you have passages which begin, see the child, see the mother, and so forth. Cherenes, you will see. It's a very common rhetorical formula. And but Bernard is not, his spirituality is not one of imaginative reconstruction of gospel scenes. We have to get that in mind. Even his devotion to the humanity of Christ was the devotion of a glorified humanity, devotion to the glorified humanity of Christ, which we know the quality of because of the way that Christ acted on earth. It is the same Christ about whom we know from the Gospels that is no longer to be known by imagination, but is known directly, because in Bernard's view, in the ascension, Christ passed beyond this world, beyond the limits of this world, in order to be present to each one of us directly. If you like kind of scientific jargon, he passed out of space-time to be present at all points within space-time. So the ascension wasn't really a departure, but an arrival at all points in space-time. And so that, as a result, Christ is really present here. And we don't have to turn the handle of our head and try and have the gospel scenes trotting over our eyes, and the woman of Samaria and the puppy dogs under the table and so forth, and that type of thing, because that's only imagination. That's fantasy, very pious fantasy, but it's fantasy. Whereas we have the real thing present, that Christ is actually present with us by virtue of the ascension. He's actually present as the Word incarnate, with whom we're able to make direct contact through our own centres, our own spirits. And so the basis of Bernard's devotion to Christ was not the incarnation as an end of everything, but the incarnation as the means by which we know and by which the Word became a glorified Jesus Christ. And so it was direct spiritual contact with the Word that Bernard propagated, not imaginative reproduction of the events of his earthly life. And so one of these texts, if we have once known Christ according to the flesh, then we know him in that way no longer. One of his Christmas sermons, that's the way he starts off. I've often admired his courage in the sense that, everybody comes to the crib and so forth, but he's saying, listen, it's not just a a sentimental reproduction of historical events that we're talking about. What is actual is the real presence of Christ at every point in space-time, and most particularly wherever there are human beings. And that Christ is actually present, and contact is actually possible. It's not a question of imagination. And so the Christology of St. Bernard needs a lot of nuancing. People who say he was the first Franciscan, he was the forerunner of this, and so forth, it's just not true. His own thing was at a much higher level, particularly for monks. In the De Diligendo Dei, he speaks about sentimental devotion to the person of Christ and says it's very necessary. It brings the person out of their own subjectivity and introduces them to spiritual things, but it's something to be gone beyond. Not to a kind of dematerialized spirituality, but a spirituality which is based on present contact with the glorified humanity of Christ. The marriage of anima and the word, if you want to know who Bernard's girlfriend was, it was anima, the soul. The marriage of anima and the word takes place at the level of spirit. It's not a question of sentiment or emotion. And so he often has this theme, Christus Spiritus, Christ the Spirit. Christ is now spiritualized by virtue of the ascension. Likewise, in the same way with the question of Our Lady, anima was his first girlfriend, his second one was ecclesia, and the third one, I suppose, was Maria. Likewise, Bernard has a sincere and tender devotion to the Virgin Mary. He couldn't be a medieval Christian without that, and it's quite clear in his homilies on Missus Est, his homilies and sermons for the various Marian feasts, that he has a real and unself-conscious devotion to Our Lady. But it's not the first thing that comes to his mind. For example, when he comes to comment on the Song of Songs, it is anima that he thinks of as the bride of Christ, not Maria. Rupert of Deutz had written a commentary on the Song of Songs which had a totally Marian interpretation. But this just never occurred to Bernard at all, who rather followed the line of Origen. His devotion is so natural that it fits into the theological scheme of things very easily, and it does not need to be mentioned explicitly on every occasion. Methinks the lady doth protest too much. I mean, he had devotion and he had love for Our Lady, and so he didn't need to talk about it every day. If there was a feast of Our Lady, he gladly and willingly, especially the Assumption, which of course is the counterpart of the Ascension, the going upwards, would preach beautifully on the various feasts of Our Lady, and no inhibition at all. But he was able to speak on other things because it was just so much part of his life, so well integrated that he didn't have to keep coming back to it. It's like somebody who doesn't feel so good about a relation who's living in the house will often make extra efforts to speak to them and say, "You all right, mother, are you?" Just because it doesn't feel anything, and always mentioning things and so forth as a way of compensating for that. Bernard, of course, was also one of those who opposed the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, and had great difficulty with it, and it's very interesting to read what he had to say on that score. But just to say, I've given a couple of seminars on Bernard to a lay spirituality centre, and people flock along, but out of, say, 80 people that might come for a weekend, 20 of them would be hoping to hear, expected that it would be about Our Lady. They said, "Mention Bernard, it must be on Our Lady. What else did he know about?" And that's the kind of reputation that he has. And in fact, it's rather unjustified. The statement, De Maria numquam satis, about Mary, we can never get enough. It's usually attributed to Bernard, but he never said it. At least if he said it, he didn't say it to me. I haven't come across it, Jean Leclerc hasn't come across it, and nobody quite knows where it began, except you find things as Blessed Bernard said, De Maria Nunquam Satis. And so every penny halfpenny preacher stands up and quotes it. Here's a good phrase to justify a recycling of an old Marian homily on the Feast of Pentecost. And so, De Maria Nunquam Satis, and off we go. But Bernard had a very integrated, synthetic view of things. Mary had an important part in his spirituality. There's absolutely no doubt about that. You're not going on. All right, we'll only be a minute or two more. All right, just two more questions before we have our coffee break. Was Bernard a mystic? Heresy number 644. Well, I don't know. Compared with the developments of the 14th and 17th century, Bernard appears as a rank amateur. He doesn't talk much about mystical things in a very personal. In fact, there's relatively little about prayer as such in his writings. We'll be probably looking at Sermon 107, De Diversis, which is on how to pray to God. It's very interesting just what sort of things Bernard would say about prayer. Bernard predated the psychocentric approach to prayer, said he with a snarl on his lips, psychocentric, which, sees prayer as something that happens in here, and had little interested in what we would call mysticism. You wouldn't find him flocking around those bookshops, probably in every Canadian city as they are in every Australian city, where you can buy everything from astrology to yoga to Thomas Merton to anything that's got mysticism in the title you can find there. And people buy them. They're kept in business. Bernard wasn't interested in that scene, I don't think, even if it existed. His was the approach chronicled in Cuthbert Butler's book, Western Mysticism, which was roundly condemned by many people for years and years and years and years. And Benedetto Calati has come out in 1980 with a defence of it, saying he really, was sat upon by the philo-scholastics, and there's much more in this book. He compares Augustine and Bernard and Gregory. Very interesting book. And just showing how how holistic their approach to mysticism was, which tied experience in prayer very closely to daily fidelity and saw prayer less as an intense introspective exercise than as a leaven which seasons one's entire life. Far from being a concentration on interior states, prayer was viewed as being nourished by reading and practically sustained by the Opus Dei, and so forth. Then the last bit there is how to cope with Bernard's flowery language. Well, you just have to get used to it, and if possible, read him in Latin, where it's much better. But we better make a break.